Hello and welcome to Sci-Fi Traveler, friends. In this episode, we'll be listening to the incredible story of Nova and Carter. Sit back and buckle up. Sci-Fi Traveler is about to begin. Enjoy the show. There are precisely 419 things I am good at, and I have counted them because counting is one of them. I can plot a blind jump through the throat of a dying star with the lights off and a cup of coffee balanced on my knee. I can recite the drift coefficients of 9 separate star drives the way other men recite the names of their children. Give me a wounded courier ship limping in on half a reactor and a prayer, and I will bring her home so gently she won't spill a drop. I am, by every metric the fleet keeps, an extraordinary navigator. I am also, by every metric that actually matters, a profound and irredeemable coward, but only on one specific subject. And her name is Nova. She came aboard the Concorde at the ragged edge of the Halcyon system, where the stars thin out and the dark gets serious about being dark. She came to oversee a treaty so delicate that the diplomatic corps had spent 6 months arguing about the shape of the negotiating table before anyone dared argue about the shape of the peace. Her people and mine, two stubborn species who'd spent the better part of a century aiming very expensive weapons at one another, were finally going to attempt the radical experiment of being friends. And they had sent her to seal it, a queen, calm as deep water, with pale gold skin that caught the ship's low light like something I wasn't supposed to look at directly. She looked, in nearly every respect, like a human woman. This was, frankly, the entire problem. If she'd had 4 arms or breathed methane or glowed an alarming shade of municipal green, I could have managed. I am a professional. But she was almost exactly like us, save for the long, tapered ears that swept back from her temples. Elegant, attentive things that, I would later learn the hard way, could catch a whisper across a crowded hall and sort it cleanly from the rattle of the silverware. Those ears were the one honest reminder that she'd been born 40 light years from the nearest place I had ever called home. I handled this the way my entire species seems specifically engineered to handle the important things. I avoided it with tremendous skill. For 3 weeks, I was a marvel of restraint. I delivered my reports to the captain in crisp, complete sentences. I nodded at Nova in the corridors with the warm neutrality of a man greeting a vending machine. I did not stare. I did not stammer. I hummed off-key at my console, as I always do, and if I happened to hum a little more whenever she passed behind me on her way to the observation deck, well, the ship's mind never reported it, and the ship's mind reports absolutely everything. And then, because the pressure of an unspoken thing will eventually find a crack in even the most disciplined coward, I did the single stupidest thing available to me. I wrote it down. All of it. Every traitorous, undiplomatic, wildly unprofessional thought I'd been hauling around like contraband. I wrote it in plain earth script, the old curling alphabet none of her people had any earthly reason to read, and I told myself this made it safe, that confessing to a folder was the same as confessing to no one. Which is the kind of logic that sounds completely airtight at 2 in the morning and falls spectacularly apart the instant a queen is standing in your doorway holding the evidence. I did not, in my defense, write a love letter. I want that on the record. A love letter has structure. A love letter has dignity. What I wrote was closer to the panicked transcript of a man steadily losing an argument with himself. And somewhere in the thick of it, between an honest line about the way she looked at the stars and another about her thoroughly unreasonable calm, I made one observation of a more, let us say, anatomical character. 1. A single sentence I was certain would die quietly in the dark with all the rest. Then I buried the entire confession 3 folders deep beneath my navigation logs, in an archive I labeled, with the towering confidence of a man who has never once been correct about this, Nav Archive 7. No queen, I reasoned, would ever go looking. No queen could ever decipher it if she did. I had calculated the odds. I had run the numbers twice. I was, as the next several minutes would go on to prove with merciless and unhurried precision, wrong by a margin large enough to have its own gravity. It was a ship's evening when the margin caught up with me, which is to say it was the arbitrary hour the Concorde had agreed to call night so that her crew could pretend the void outside ran on a schedule. I was off shift, boots off, halfway through the noble work of doing absolutely nothing, when the chime at my door sounded, and I opened it expecting the quartermaster, or the captain, or at the very worst some envoy who'd gotten lost between the galley and the airlock. It was Nova. She stood in the doorway with the unhurried stillness of deep water, pale gold under the corridor's low light, and held between two fingers a single sheet of plain earth script. She held it the way one holds an exhibit at a tribunal, at a slight, deliberate distance, so the accused has time to recognize his own handwriting. The ship hummed around us. Somewhere far below, a reactor ticked over in its cradle, and Nova read the line aloud, slowly, savoring each syllable like a word she'd been saving for exactly this occasion. "So you really like my butt, human. I have, as I mentioned, plotted blind jumps through dying stars. I have stared down a reactor breach with a steady pulse. None of it prepared me for this." My mouth opened and performed a small, ambitious series of shapes, every one of them producing precisely no sound, like a fish attempting diplomacy. What eventually escaped me was not a sentence, so much as a controlled crash. I heard myself say the word context. I heard myself say metaphor, which was a bald-faced lie, as there had been nothing metaphorical about it whatsoever. And then, to my eternal and unending shame, I heard myself, a grown man and a decorated navigator, reach for the word thermodynamics, as though the second law of the universe might somehow rise up and explain why I'd written what I'd written. It did not. The universe has never once helped me when I needed it, and it wasn't about to start over a folder. That, I managed, when the ramble had finally run out of fuel, was supposed to be private. It was very private, Nova agreed pleasantly. It was 3 folders deep, under your navigation logs, in an archive you labeled, she glanced at the sheet, though I knew she didn't need to, Nav Archive 7. How? I said. It was not a complete question. It was all I had. She tilted her head, and the long, tapered ears caught the light and shifted, attentive. And then she explained, with the patience of a woman addressing a slow but well-meaning child, what I should have understood from the first day she came aboard. Her people did not hear the world the way mine did. Those elegant ears caught frequencies humans had never bothered to name. The hum of a failing relay 2 decks down, the particular pitch of a lie, the dry mechanical whisper of a man who talks to himself while he types, and does not realize that his fingers and his breath are broadcasting in a language all their own. She had not, she clarified, read over my shoulder. She had simply been 3 corridors away, 1 quiet shift, listening to the ship the way she always did, and heard a navigator murmuring something to a folder he thought was deaf. "You heard me typing," I said. "I heard you confessing," she corrected, "to your furniture. The folder was easy after that. Your people's encryption is charming, but it assumes the only way into a locked room is the door." I sat down on the edge of my bunk because my legs had filed the same early retirement my nervous system had filed 3 weeks prior. I had, it was becoming clear, underestimated her, comprehensively, on every available axis. The way you underestimate a chess opponent right up until the moment the board belongs to her. She seemed entirely unsurprised by this. She observed, not unkindly, that underestimating her appeared to be something of a species-wide tradition among humans, and that she had stopped taking it personally somewhere around our second war. I braced for the rest. The complaint. The cool, diplomatic notice that a navigator's improper sentiments could not be permitted to endanger a treaty 6 months in the making. I had already begun, somewhere in the back of my collapsing mind, to draft my own resignation. But Nova did not file a complaint. She stepped fully into the doorway, the letter still held lightly between 2 fingers, and she did not look away, not the way a sovereign looks past a subordinate, but the way a person looks at another person they have decided, for reasons of their own, are worth the trouble. She had read every word I'd buried, and she had not, I was slowly and dangerously beginning to understand. Come all this way down the corridor merely to give it back. She did not, it turned out, come to give it back at all. She came to talk, which among her people is a far more dangerous activity than it is among mine. I learned this slowly, the way I learn most things that matter, by getting them wrong first. Nova settled herself against the frame of my door, in no apparent hurry to be anywhere a queen ought to be, and explained that on her world, feelings were not contraband. They were not buried 3 folders deep beneath a navigation log. They were said, out loud, in the open, to the actual face of the actual person, the way my people might remark that it looked like rain. A Lyran who felt a thing and did not speak it was considered not discreet but faintly unwell, like someone walking around with a splinter they refused, out of sheer stubbornness, to remove. So when I find a human, she said, who felt a thing so strongly he wrote it down in a secret alphabet and sealed it in a locked room and then told no one, not even the person it was about, I confess I did not know what to make of it. Among my people, that is either the most cowardly thing a man can do. She paused, and the long ears tilted, weighing me. Or the most romantic. I have not yet decided which. It's both, I said with feeling. We invented the concept of doing both at once. It's our finest contribution to the galaxy. She did not laugh exactly. Her people don't, not the way mine do, all teeth and noise. Instead, something moved behind her eyes, quick and bright, the way light shifts under deep water when a large thing passes far below the surface. Early on, I had decided this was her version of laughing. I had also decided, with great discipline, never to tell her I'd been keeping a private log of every time it happened. And then I tried, God help me, to explain it to her, the entire Baroque human machinery for avoiding the obvious. I told her about rank, about the long, cold distance the fleet kept between a navigator and a visiting head of state. I told her about the treaty, balanced on its knife's edge after 6 months and 2 wars, and roughly 900 arguments about furniture. I pointed out reasonably that one does not risk an interstellar incident over a crush, that there were envoys 2 decks up who would happily detonate the entire alliance if they caught so much as a whiff of impropriety between the Queen and the man who steers the boat. You make it sound very logical, Nova observed. It is very logical. It is very frightened, she said, wearing logic like a coat. I opened my mouth to defend the coat. She did not let me, because then she told me something I had not braced for. And a man can brace for almost anything except being seen. She said she had noticed me too. Not, she clarified, with a dryness that could have sanded a hull, the more anatomical observations from the letter, which she allowed had been memorable in their own right, but which were not, in the end, the thing. She had noticed the navigator who hummed off key over his console on the long shifts, badly, the same 4 bars of something he plainly didn't know the words to. She had heard about the night I'd stayed awake 40 hours straight to talk a wounded courier ship down out of a decaying orbit, refusing to hand off the console because the pilot on the other end was 19 and terrified, and I was the only voice she had. And she had watched me, more than once, look up from my work at the stars in the viewport, and she said I looked at them the way her people are taught, from childhood, to look at the sea, like something vast and old that you love precisely because it will never love you back. And that's all right, because that was never the point. That, she said quietly, is the man I noticed. The letter only told me his handwriting. I sat there in the wreckage of my own composure and found I had nothing professional left to say. So the but, I said finally, because I am who I am, was just, what, a footnote? It was how I learned your handwriting, she agreed, entirely serious, the corner of her mouth betraying her. Everything important I read after. Somewhere 2 decks down, Mabel, the ship's mind, who I would remind you reports everything, chose to say nothing at all, which from Mabel was practically a wedding toast. And I understood, sitting there, that the dangerous thing had already happened. Not the letter, the talking. On her world, they knew what I was only beginning to suspect on mine, that the locked room is never as safe as you think, and that the bravest door in the universe is the one you open with your own mouth. The universe, which had ignored my every prior request for assistance, chose this exact moment to take a sudden and energetic interest in my life. The chime came first, not the soft one at my door, but the bright, insistent three-note pattern that means the bridge wants you and the bridge wants you now. And then Mabel's voice filled the room, because Mabel never met a silence she didn't want to improve. The ship's mind had, over 3 weeks, developed a personality the crew universally agreed was that of a relentlessly cheerful aunt who has never once read a room, and she deployed it now with devastating timing. "Apologies for the interruption," Mabel said, in the tone of someone who is not remotely sorry, "but the captain requires all senior officers on the bridge. The Halcyon negotiators have begun the ring alignment ceremony 2 hours ahead of schedule, and I'm pleased to report that tensions down there have gotten interesting." A pause. "I do love it when they get interesting." "Mabel," I said, "define interesting." 3 delegations are no longer speaking to one another. One ambassador has accused another of insulting his grandmother, and someone has unplugged the translation array out of what I can only describe as spite. Another pause, sunny and merciless. "Also, navigator, your heart rate is somewhat elevated. Shall I log it?" "Do not log it." "Logging it as ceremony-related stress," Mabel said warmly, which was a lie we both understood to be a kindness, and possibly blackmail. Nova and I had, at some point in the last 4 seconds, sprung apart to a careful and entirely respectable meter of distance. 2 professionals abruptly and violently remembering who we were supposed to be. She was a queen. I was the man who made sure the ship didn't drive itself into a sun. There had, the official record would forever insist, been nothing happening in this doorway. Nothing whatsoever. A queen had simply stopped by to discuss navigation. At night. Holding a personal letter, as one does. The corridor outside had already filled with the particular chaos of a diplomatic emergency in progress. Envoys swept past in their formal colors, aides chasing them with data slates, somebody's protocol officer arguing in 3 languages at once with what was either a junior diplomat or a houseplant. Below us, through the great curved viewport at the corridor's end, the rings of Halcyon turned in slow, indifferent gold, vast, serene, ancient beyond reckoning, and entirely unbothered by the fact that 2 delegations of allegedly intelligent beings were down there, nearly coming to blows over the precise angle at which a planet's jewelry ought to catch the light. It would have been very easy in that moment for the whole thing to simply dissolve. I felt it begin to. Protocol has a gravity all its own, and it was pulling us both back into our proper orbits. The letter would be refolded. The feeling would be reburied, deeper this time, in a folder no one would ever find. The Queen would return to her tribunal and her treaty, and the navigator to his console, and by morning we would have arrived at the silent, civilized agreement that the doorway had never happened at all. That some things, however true, are simply not permitted to be true at the same time as a peace between worlds. I had reburied feelings before. I knew the procedure. I could already feel my hands reaching for the shovel. Nova was watching me do it. She always saw the things I thought I was doing quietly. "Navigator," she said, and there was something careful underneath the formality now. A thing held very still so it wouldn't spill. "We will be needed on the bridge." "We will," I agreed. My voice came out steadier than I felt, which is the one genuine talent cowardice ever gave me. "And after." It was not quite a question. Her ears caught the light as she tilted her head, and I understood she was asking whether after would exist at all, or whether I would let the emergency do my running for me, the way a frightened man lets a fire alarm excuse him from a conversation he was already desperate to flee. I didn't answer. I'm not proud of that. I told myself there wasn't time, that the bridge was waiting, that an ambassador had insulted a grandmother, and the array was unplugged, and the rings were turning, and the whole fragile architecture of peace was wobbling on its pins, 2 decks down. And all of that was true, and none of it was the reason. The reason was that opening that particular door with my own mouth was still the single most terrifying maneuver in my entire catalog. And I had spent my whole life proving I would fly through a dying star before I'd attempt it. So I said, "We should go." And Nova said, "Yes." And we went. 2 careful meters apart, down a corridor full of shouting, toward a ceremony coming apart at the seams, with the unfinished thing trailing behind us like a tether neither of us had quite decided to cut. The bridge, when we reached it, was exactly the controlled disaster Mabel had advertised. And for the next 2 hours, I got to do the one thing in the universe I am unambiguously good at. I got to be useful. The ring alignment ceremony, it transpired, was not merely decorative. The Halcyon negotiators had chosen the neutral world precisely because its great rings could be read like a clock by both our peoples. And the treaty was to be signed at the exact instant the planet's gold bands fell into a particular configuration, a moment both species independently regarded as auspicious and which would not recur for another 60 years. The problem, as problems tend to be, was a small one wearing a large costume. The unplugged translation array had thrown the timing off, and now 2 delegations were each convinced the other was stalling on purpose to claim the more favorable alignment. And the whole ceremony had begun to slide gently toward the precise interstellar incident I'd spent 3 weeks insisting we couldn't afford. What they needed was someone who could compute, very fast and without panicking, exactly when the rings would next reach true configuration, and hold the ship in a window narrow enough to hit it. What they had was me. I plugged my heart and both hands into the nav console and did the work I was built for. And for 2 hours, the doorway and the letter and the unfinished thing all went quiet, the way everything goes quiet when the math is hard enough and the stakes are high enough, and you finally, mercifully, have something to do with your fear. We hit the window. The rings came true. The treaty held, signed in orbit beneath the turning gold, and the envoys who had nearly come to blows over a grandmother's honor embraced like the whole thing had been their idea. Mabel announced the alignment with the smug satisfaction of an aunt whose terrible nephew has finally amounted to something, and noted for the record, she said, that my heart rate had been admirably steady throughout, which it had. It is a strange feature of my particular cowardice that I am fearless about everything except the one thing worth being brave for. And then the crisis was over, and there was nothing left to hide behind. And that is precisely when Nova came and found me. She caught me in the quiet seam between one emergency and the next, after the envoys had dispersed and the bridge had emptied, and the array was, mercifully, plugged back in. I had retreated to my console, which is where I retreat. She crossed to me without ceremony and set the letter down on the panel beside my hands, gently, deliberately, the way you set down something you have decided not to carry alone anymore. The Earth script caught the low light. Neither of us pretended not to see it. "I have signed a treaty today," she said. "I have ended a war that took 2 of them to start. I have shaken the hand of a man who 3 hours ago was prepared to dissolve the alliance over his grandmother." Her ears tilted, catching me in that attentive way. And I find I did not cross 40 light years and 100 diplomatic landmines to watch a brave man go shy on me at the very last step. "You were not frightened of the rings. Do not tell me you are frightened of me." "I'm not frightened of you," I said, which was almost true. "I'm frightened of the part where I say it out loud and it becomes real, and I can't put it back in the folder. That," she said, "is the only part that was ever worth anything." And so I did the single thing my entire species seems engineered from the ground up to avoid. I opened the terrible door with my own mouth. Out loud, unhidden, in the open, the way her people did it, the way I had never once managed in 31 years of being a coward with 419 talents, and not one of them, this. I said the real thing, the thing underneath the joke, and underneath the letter, and underneath the metaphor that hadn't been a metaphor. that I had fallen for her, plainly and completely, and that I'd buried it in a locked room not because it was small, but because it was the largest thing I'd ever felt, and I had no idea where a man was supposed to put a thing that size. Beyond the viewport, the distant star caught the rings of Halcyon and lit them gold. And it was, I thought, an absurd and enormous backdrop for a navigator confessing he'd come undone over a folder and a pair of remarkable ears. Nova smiled. Not the light under deep water flicker I'd been secretly logging for 3 weeks. A real one, open and unguarded, the first I had ever been allowed to see. The writing, she said softly, was the cowardly part. This is the brave one. You see, you can do the brave thing. You only needed someone to unplug the door. The treaty held. That was the headline, and the historians would keep it. 2 stubborn species who'd spent a century perfecting the art of pointing weapons at one another took their first careful step towards something better, signed in orbit beneath the turning rings of a world that belonged to neither of them. The envoys went home heroes. The ambassador who had defended his grandmother's honor unto the brink of war gave a speech, on the way out, about courage and reconciliation, and Mabel played it back for me twice with what I can only describe as editorial relish. By some small miracle of cosmic accounting, the same evening that ended one war left just enough room in the universe for 2 people to begin negotiating a far smaller and far more complicated piece of their own. We were, it must be said, terrible at it. This surprised neither of us. I had warned her in the doorway that my people had invented the concept of doing the brave thing and the cowardly thing simultaneously, and I was determined to honor that heritage. The first morning after, I greeted her in the corridor with the warm neutrality of a man addressing a vending machine, purely out of habit, and then had to spend the next several minutes explaining to a queen that this had been affection and not a relapse. Her people, who said everything out loud, found my entire emotional architecture endlessly diagnosable. My people, who said nothing, found her terrifying. We worked out the protocols the way we worked out everything else. Badly at first, then better. 2 hearts and 2 worlds inventing the rules as we went, with frequent and unhelpful commentary from a ship's mind who had appointed herself, without anyone's permission, the official chronicler of the whole affair. Mabel took to logging my heart rate whenever Nova entered a room and announcing the figure aloud as a service. I asked her to stop. She filed my request under suggestions and never spoke of it again, which is how Mabel says no. There was the matter of the envoys too, and the long, cold distance the fleet kept between a navigator and a head of state, the very gravity I'd been so certain would tear the thing apart. It turned out to be less iron than I'd feared. Nova, who had ended a war over a misaligned ring, was not especially intimidated by a seating chart. She simply informed the relevant parties, with the unhurried calm of deep water, that the navigator who had held the ship in the alignment window had earned a place at her table, and that anyone who wished to debate the point was welcome to recompute the orbit themselves. No one volunteered. It is remarkable how quickly protocol bends when the person bending it has personally prevented an interstellar incident before lunch. And me, I changed too, though it took me the longest to notice, the way it always does. For 31 years, I had kept a precise and private catalog of my 419 talents, every one of them a thing I could do alone, in the dark, with the door shut. Not one of them had ever required me to be seen. I'd built an entire competent life out of the locked room, the secret alphabet, the buried folder, the feeling sealed where it could never embarrass me by becoming real. I had been so good at it, and it had so nearly cost me the only thing I'd ever wanted that the math, finally, refused to balance. So I added a 420th talent to the list, and it was the hardest one, and it was this: saying the true thing out loud, to the actual face of the actual person, before some emergency could come along and say it for me. I was still bad at it. I expect I will always be a little bad at it, but I had learned, at last, that the locked room was never as safe as it looked, and that the bravest door in the entire catalog universe is the one you open with your own mouth, and that on the far side of it sometimes, someone is waiting who decided you were worth the trouble back when all she had was your handwriting. When the Concorde finally broke orbit and Halcyon shrank behind us to a bright ringed coin in the viewport, I returned to my console to find my navigation logs exactly as I'd left them. Every folder in its place, every coefficient where it belonged, all but the one buried 3 deep, Nav Archive 7, the locked room, the coward's vault, which was empty now. The letter had been taken. I found it later, and I should have known I would. It had been folded with great care and tucked into the place her people keep the things they mean to keep, and pinned to it, in unhurried Earth script, newly learned and plainly enjoyed far too much, were a few words in a hand that was just beginning to find its shape. For the record, yes, the human. And below them the ringed planet wheeled on in the dark, indifferent and enormous and no help to anyone, exactly as it had been from the start. For once, I didn't need it to be. There's something Carter never quite said, never even articulated at the end. The letter wasn't actually about Nova's ears, the rest of her body, or the lines where he was certain she would die silently in the dark. The letter was about the locked room. It was about a man who knew 419 ways to be brave alone, and not a single way that worked when the lights were on and someone else was at the door. And the only reason his story had a happy ending was because someone looked into the folder he swore no one would ever open. So, before the rings stop spinning and we make our way to the next world, I leave you with the question Carter refused to ask himself for 31 years. What's in your locked room? We all have one, something we feel so strongly about that we write it down somewhere safe, a draft we never send, a confession we rehearse in the car and then swallow, a real sentence we seal 3 folders deep in the navigation logs of an ordinary, competent life, telling ourselves that silently feeling it is the same as being honest. It's not. Carter learned this the hard way, and the universe took almost everything from him for that lesson. The bravest door in the entire cataloged universe is still the one you open with your own mouth. And perhaps somewhere, someone who has already decided you're worth the trouble, someone who only has your handwriting, is already waiting on the other side of that door. Don't let them wait for an emergency to tell you that. Yes, friends, we've come to the end of another story. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to click the like button. Don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'll be back with a new adventure very soon, so subscribe to Sci-Fi Traveler so you don't miss it. See you in the next story. Take care.